Echo to re-echo in 3 easy steps and 100 or more trickier bits. Step 1, remove the pick guard. Well, that was easy enough. It had warped itself off many years ago and was only held on with sticky pads. Step 2, remove the machine heads. I'm going to replace these with nice Goto tuners. Step 3, remove the bolt-on neck. Well, screws, not bolts, but they released easily enough. So, to the first of the trickier bits, remove the frets. It's not too difficult. I used a soldering iron and end cutting nippers to ease them out, thankfully without any breakout of the fretboard. The fingerboard was well pitted from long use, so I used a radius block to sand it back to a level surface. I opted for a 12-inch radius. I also reprofiled the neck because it was a bit too chunky for my liking. I chose Evo Gold for the fret wire and I pressed them in with a caul rather than using a soft hammer. I fashioned my own fret press out of odds and ends. I didn't need to do much fret levelling, but I did spend some time dressing the fret ends with a file. I covered the headstock with a veneer because the bare wood was ugly with non-matching sides. I tried my hand at a little simple marquetry at the same time, all straight cuts. Kudos to anyone who spots the design influence. Flushed with my success on the front, I went a bit wilder on the back. Sadly, my over-enthusiastic sanding completely removed the mosaic in the centre of the sunflower. C'est la vie. A friend had wondered if sanding back the top would improve the tone, so I set out to do just that. There we are, it's all gone. Now I can use this opportunity to have a go at French polishing while I've got the chance. Let's put it back together and try it out. It didn't make a ha'porth of difference to the tone, but the neck was more comfortable to play. I might still trim a little more off the top end at some point. So now it's time to work on a new soundboard. I'm hoping to get a bigger voice from the guitar. I've opted for Lutz Spruce on this job. I don't have a jack plane, so I contrived a flat bed and a flat edge to sand the joining surfaces. There was no visible gap when I held the two sides together up to the light, so I went ahead and glued them. I saw this gluing technique on YouTube. It did the job, but I think I'll keep it flat and use wedges next time. The spruce was 4.5mm thick, way too chunky for this job, I thought. I was aiming for a final thickness of around 3mm. In the absence of a thicknessing sander, I decided to route out parallel channels using a piece of cardboard on the cut side as a sled to keep the route a bit vertical and get a flat cut on the bottom. Well, a ploughed field cut as it turned out. I used a sanding block to knock back the furrows until it was all smooth. Next task, remove the plastic binding. Just a little persuasion with a heat gun and it all came away quite cleanly. I used a small Japanese saw and a fret saw at times to release the top from the curved lining. Look at the size of that neck block, with little wings at the top to give added support to that divided up about. And see the damage the string ball ends have done to the bridge plate. So here I've cut roughly to shape and routed out a wide channel for the rosette, which I'll fill in with veneer. You'll see later just how close to the bone I went with this job. I cut segments from 3 almost identical veneers, formed a circle with them and glued them one on top of the other to achieve the thickness I needed. My theory was that if I sanded right through a layer, it wouldn't matter as it should be the same underneath. I released the rosette from its baseboard by routing inside and outside diameters to match the soundboard cutout, with just enough space left to slip in some walnut veneer strip around the edges. Then I routed out the sound hole from the middle. You can see some practice routing and my plans for bracing laid out on the workbench. I had a block of quarter-sawn Sitka Spruce to use for making braces, like the one in this picture. This isn't the one I used. I didn't take any pictures at the time. But rather than just cut the braces out, split the wood along the grain first, then planed it square in the vise, trying to get both the longest grain and to keep it in a vertical plane. I used butt stops on the bench when I planed them down to thickness and width. Here's a completely gratuitous shot of some shavings. I was simply delighted by the way the wood behaved with a new blade in my plane. Lovely. So here are my braces, all cut to size and laid out on the old top. I decided to add finger braces on the base side, which the Eko didn't have. I'm also going to add in a split upper face brace and some sound hole braces. Here's my logic. It's rock solid up there already, I know, but there's a definite break in continuity along the central line. I'm hoping that bracing off that big block and down the sides of the sound hole to the X braces might improve the sustain a bit. Let's wait and see. I can't easily fit the small braces to the big block because they're not on the same base, so I'll brace against a larger flying brace that will butt up against the corner of the neck block, where I can fit a little buttress if need be to make a sound joint. It should also offer a little protection to the rosette, which will need to be cut through to fit the neck. There's the bracing plan all transferred to the wood. Time to fit the jigsaw together now. First up is the bridge plate. Silly me, didn't clamp the X braces down tight enough, and they wandered a little when I was checking for gaps in trimming. I had to use a razor saw to trim it back to the line after it was glued on. Next up are the wee sound hole and finger braces, and the first attempt at carving them to shape. I'm happy enough with those. That's all the flat braces. Now the first of the curved braces, the lower face braces, or tone bars. I'm happy with them too. Now for the X braces. One at a time, thank you, just to make sure I can make each one meet the edge of the bridge plate snugly. There you go, both on, ready for carving. Note the little flying braces above the sound hole too, but I've explained all that. And there's the whole family of braces, carved and complete. Just add a few cleats to strengthen the centre seam, and glue on a little cloth to strengthen the X-brace lap joint, and the top's ready for fitting. After sawing off the original curved lining level with the sides, the whole thing needs sanding level. They're much smaller now, so I added some plain cedar lining below as strengthening, and to add support for the cutouts where the X-braces meet the sides. Because the curved lining's been cut back by 4 to 5 millimeters, the neck block cutout needs to be cut down as well. I used a selection of tools for the job, but it's bound to need some fine adjustment later on as well. I'm indebted to Mark Bailey for his clear instructions on guitar building. One thing he's very clear on is, it's the law that you both sign and date your work, and you must write a verse or a joke, a lyric or an inscription or something individual on the inside. So here's mine. Spruced up by Michael O'Connor, September 2022, Black Hill, UK. Thanks to Michael Tate for letting me convert his Eko into an eco guitar. May it range far and wide. One of my daughters has laid her claim to inherit it already. I hereby bequeath this to Lizzie O'Connor, unless it collapses. And my wife has opted into the role of the Joker this time. Or perhaps she's not being funny. So are you moving into the garage? Right, let's pop the lid on. Here it is being dry clamped to check there are no gaps first. Now it's glued on, and there's plenty of healthy squeeze out all around. I can tidy most of that up with a glue chisel when it's half set. There you go, all stuck on, and it doesn't even fall off when you tip it up either. Marvellous. I'm using cut down pop rivets here to locate the neck so I can mark where to cut the top to accommodate the neck. That's where to cut it. Now if you look at the cross section of the rosette inlay, you can see that I nearly routed right through the soundboard. Those screws are going to penetrate deeper into the neck now, so I better check the height and drill out the holes a little rather than forcing them in. That's a fairly good fit. The angle seems about right too, but without a bridge it's difficult to judge. I did buy a Martin style bridge from Tone Tech, made out of tintal wood. Apparently that's from a tamarind tree. But I decided not to use it because it felt so heavy and dense. I thought some of the sound energy might be lost within it rather than get transmitted through. And even if it does transmit perfectly, it still felt like a very rigid chunk of wood that I think might deaden the top. It might as well have been made of bakelite. So I made an ebony bridge, according to Mark's instructions. Take a blank piece of ebony, plane, and shape it flat and square. Make a jig for your router to cut the saddle slot at an angle. Mark measures out 1/8 of an inch over 3 inches to get the angle. But since it's a 12-inch piece of wood, I reckoned it was better to measure a fall of 1/2 an inch over the full 12 inches to get the angle right. Mine was a 3.2mm bit, but when I measured the slot I had cut, it was more like 3.6 to 3.8, probably because that guide is only fixed at one point, and there was some play. It just means I'll need to use either a 4mm saddle blank or pad it out with some veneer. I prefer the first option. Hey presto, holes all in a straight line. Sometime later, that'll do nicely. Take one 4mm bone saddle blank, cut it to length, sand or file the top to match the radius of the fretboard, mark it out to compensate for intonation across the strings, file to shape. Like this. Fit the saddle snugly into the slot in the bridge. Tape the bridge temporarily in place on the top according to scale length calculations. Then I used a temporary tailpiece to fit strings and tune the guitar to pitch. Then by using a meter and checking by ear, I found exactly where to position the bridge so that all the strings had matching 12th fret harmonics and fretted notes. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, I did a test run of routing for binding on some scrap tonewood and then on my work table. Suitably emboldened, I went ahead and routed all around the guitar. Note the sanding sealer applied around the edge first. I bridged the gap at the neck with a block so I could route straight across it. That seemed to go okay. So now to bend the rosewood binding to shape. I used the nozzle of my temperature controlled heat gun. It seems to do the trick okay. Bending them as a pair was a great tip, thanks Mark. My router cut deeper than my binding, but I have some metre-long walnut veneer strips and plenty other veneer, so I can build it up. I glued a strip of walnut in place first, and then cut thin strips of a paler wood and glued them on with angled butt joints. I used super glue for this. Glued the rosewood binding in place with white glue. I did de-tack the sellotape on the face first before I stuck it down, honest. It's dried overnight, so it's time to carefully remove the sellotape. Oh dear, and other such heartfelt expressions. Tear out. I used gentle heat from the heat gun to soften the adhesive before removing the rest of the sellotape. Undeterred, I cut back the binding to meet the top and sanded away the blemishes, and it doesn't look too bad. Unfortunately, again in my enthusiasm, I sanded right through all the veneers at the top corner of the rosette to reveal the base layer I had glued them onto. Oh well, it still has that rustic Nordic look I was aiming for. So I masked off the area where the bridge will be glued and set to with shellac, meths and linseed oil to French polish it. Shiny-ish. Shiny-isher. Shiny enough. For a superior finish, I thoroughly recommend moth-infused shellac. Off with the masking tape, on with the bridge. Fixed. Note the slots in front of the bridge pin holes. I decided to use slotless bone bridge pins in an effort to get the best sound. I didn't have a tapered reamer, but I wanted a snug fit for the pins, so I had drilled my bridge pin holes out at 4.8mm to begin with. After gluing in place, I drilled through the soundboard and bridge plate with a 4.5mm drill. Then I drilled out just the top few millimetres of each hole with a 5mm drill. Then I used a small rat tail file to clear out each hole in turn until each pin sat snugly with its head just touching the top of the bridge. I considered making a pinhole saw from a hacksaw blade as suggested by Mark, but instead I used a fine drill bit in a Dremel-like tool. Again, I fitted each individual slot to its string. The thicker strings especially are very wide by the ball end, so they needed more cutaway at the bottom. I used a mirror to make sure everything was neat and dandy. I did take a little more material off the neck before its final fitting too. I needed to use a shim to correct the neck angle with the bridge in place. I even had to trim the shim to get it just right. And there she is in all her glory. Now I'd better check that intonation. I'm very happy with the sound of the guitar, but the playability is not quite right yet. The action and the intonation are good, but the outer strings, particularly the low E, can slip off the edge of the fingerboard. I'm still using the old nut, or string guide really, since there's a 0 fret, and I did narrow the neck slightly, so I need to fashion a replacement. I've got a bone nut blank here, which I've cut to the new neck width and marked new, slightly narrower string positions, which should stop the outer strings from coming over the sides. Note how I've angled the slots towards each string post. That's it, complete and installed in position. It feels much more secured now. Job done, I think. Thank you for listening. All the music you've heard has been played on this guitar, either by myself, by my daughter Lizzie, or by my son Richard. Big thanks to them for helping out. Thanks again to everybody for watching and listening. Happy New Year to everybody.